There's only been 9 instances throughout NHL history where the number 1 pick would get traded. We're not talking about the physical number 1 pick, however, we're talking about the actual draft pick itself. As whether it was a trade at the deadline or on the draft floor, the 9 trades that caused the pick to be swapped feature NHL Hall of Famers and some of the biggest busts in NHL history. We'll be going in chronological order to better structure the video, and we'll be talking about the player that ended up getting selected, as well as talking about impactful players that were also involved in the trade, if any. But before we begin, this video is sponsored by SeatGeek. The holiday season is here, and if you're looking for some last-minute gifts, then SeatGeek's got you covered. SeatGeek is an app that allows users to purchase tickets to games, concerts, and live events. They show you the best seats available at the best price by ranking them on a scale of 1 to 10, with the highest number being the better deal. If you want to treat yourself or a loved one this holiday season, then make sure to use my promo code IDGT at checkout to save you $20 off your first purchase. Thanks to SeatGeek for the sponsor. Now let's get into the video. Our first trade takes us back to 1971, where the NHL draft was sorta new, and most GMs still had no clue what to do, except for Montreal's Sam Pollock, who pulled off a big brain play a year before the 71 draft. That year, a player by the name of Guy Lafleur was draft eligible, and Sam had his eye on taking him. So, knowing that most GMs were still trying to understand the draft and the scouting process, he orchestrated a trade with the California Golden Seals, trading their 1970 first-round pick and Ernie Hickey for Francis Lacombe and the Seals' 71 first-round pick. Montreal's 1970 pick ended up being 10th overall, and the Seals would use that pick to select Chris Odlefson, who's more well-known as a Vancouver Canuck, if that says anything for the Golden Seals. But that 1971 first Montreal got back from the Seals ended up becoming the number 1 pick. Pollock got his wish, pulling off a 1000 IQ play, selecting his guy Guy Lafleur, who ended up becoming a Canadiens legend. Lafleur would become the all-time leading goal scorer in franchise history, lasting 17 years in the league, winning 5 Stanley Cups, 2 Hart trophies, and 3 Art Rosses. Talk about a fleece. 4 years later, the number 1 pick would again get traded in an almost laughable trade package. As at first glance, this seems like an absolute joke. The 1975 Washington Capitals are known as the worst team in NHL history, finishing with a record of 8-67-5, and they would go through all that pain, agony, and suffering to not get the number 1 pick. And here's why. Believe it or not, the Philadelphia Flyers would make a trade with Washington to acquire the number 1 pick. This was a year removed from their first championship and before the actual season, however, but Washington messed up bad, trading the eventual number 1 pick to the Flyers in exchange for the Flyers' first round pick, Bill Clement, and Don McLean. Now, Clement would actually become the Capitals' first ever captain, but the pick they acquired from Philly ended up becoming the 18th overall pick, aka the last pick in the first round, as the Flyers would take home their second consecutive cup as the Broad Street Bullies. Luckily, it seems as if Washington didn't really miss out, as the 1975 draft is notoriously one of the worst of all time, not producing a single Hall of Famer, but the Flyers would select Mel Bridgman, who ended up becoming the best player to come out of the first round. Yes, the same Mel Bridgman who forgot to charge the Ottawa Senators' laptop at the draft 20 years later. Washington would use the 18th pick to select a player who would only play 1 game in the NHL, producing 0 points. It would take another 5 years for the number 1 pick to get traded, and once it did, it would get moved 2 more times in a span of 3 seasons. First, in 1980, the Canadiens would once again be the team acquiring the first overall pick, this time making a trade with the Colorado Rockies, sending Ron Andruff and Sean Shanahan for the right to swap first round picks in 1980. GM Pollock was taking yet another gamble, considering that oh yeah, this trade was made 4 years in advance in 1976, when the Rockies were pretty bad. So essentially, Pollock was betting on the Rockies still being terrible 4 years later, giving up 2 players for nothing until 1980. And well, he was right, as the Rockies would get the number 1 pick but because of the trade made 4 years in advance, they would swap picks with Montreal, moving down from number 1 to number 19. Now, Montreal would famously or infamously select Doug Wickenheiser, who sort of became a bust, passing up on French-Canadian superstar Denis Savard and Hall of Famer Paul Coffey along the way. The Rockies would use Montreal's pick to select Paul Gagne, who became nothing more than a depth producer who bounced around the NHL. 2 years later, the Rockies would again get screwed out of the number 1 pick. As a compensation for signing Dwight Foster, the Bruins would give the Rockies a 10th round pick in exchange for a 2nd round pick and, once again, the right to swap draft picks. At least this time it wasn't for a draft 4 years in advance, but nonetheless, it would come back to once again bite the Rockies, as the pick they swapped with Boston would be, you guessed it, the number 1 pick. The pick they would get back would be pick number 18, one that the team technically didn't even get to use, as the Rockies wouldn't exist anymore come the 82 draft, becoming the New Jersey Devils. Boston would select Gord Kluzak, whose career never got to properly take off, as several knee injuries prevented Kluzak from ever reaching his full potential. Luckily, however, the 18th pick the Devils would receive in the swap was used to select defenseman Ken Daneyko, who became a proven, hard-hitting, stay-at-home defenseman, being a key piece on the Devils Stanley Cup teams years down the line. So, actually, this trade victors a team that traded away the number 1 pick. In 1983, again, the first pick would get traded away, this time to the Minnesota North Stars. Well, the trade actually occurred in 82, but the pick was for 83. Anyways, the Penguins would trade away their 1st round pick and George Ferguson to the North Stars for 2 players and their 1st round pick. And this was during a time when the Penguins looked awful. So they were amongst the bottom of the league, and their pick they traded to Minnesota ended up becoming the 1st overall pick, which the North Stars used to select Brian Lawton, the first American-born player to be selected 1st overall. And honestly, he was kind of a dud. Yeah, he had a decent career, but nothing compared to the guys selected after him, as the 7 players picked after Lawton all at least competed in one NHL All-Star game. Names that include Pat LaFontaine, Cam Neely, and Stevie Y. Also, the Penguins used the pick they received to select Bob Erie, who broke out during the late 1980s when the Penguins became good, mainly thanks to a guy named Mario Lemieux, who the North Stars ended becoming all too familiar with. The 1st overall pick didn't get traded again until 15 years later, and it would get moved twice. The Sharks would trade away former top 5 pick Victor Kozlov and a 5th round draft pick to the Florida Panthers for Dave Lowry and a 1st round pick. Then, at the trade deadline, the Sharks would trade away that first they received to the Tampa Bay Lightning for the right to flip 1st round picks and for Brian Marshman and David Shaw. This was huge, and it ended up benefiting both teams. The Sharks would win the 1st pick, but had the swap with Tampa Bay, who actually got the 2nd overall pick. The Sharks would move down 1 spot to select Brad Stewart, and they let the Predators move up to select David Legwand. But Tampa came out the biggest winners, selecting their future face of the franchise, Vincent Lecavalier, who was famously called the, quote, Michael Jordan of hockey by new owner Art Williams. And although Lecavalier never really became the GOAT like Williams wanted him to, he still produced multiple 100-point seasons, being one of the best forwards in the league. But a year later in 1999, the 1st overall pick would be used to select someone not as great, and the way it got in the hands of the Atlanta Thrashers is thanks to one man, Brian Burke. Burke, the GM of the Vancouver Canucks, had his eyes on both the Sedin twins and knew they would benefit more playing with each other rather than against each other. But he only had 1 pick, the 3rd overall pick, so he had to start making some trades. On draft day, chaos ensued. First, he would trade Brian McCabe and the 11th pick to Chicago for the 4th overall pick, and then traded the 4th overall pick and 2/3 to Tampa for the number 1 pick, which would then get moved to Atlanta for the number 2 pick, and a deal that Atlanta wouldn't take either Sedin twin 1st overall. And they didn't. instead selecting Patrick Steffen, who according to his old coach had 180 point potential, which was nowhere close to what he actually accomplished. Steffen's most notable moment in the NHL is him falling on his ass and missing a wide open net. So if that doesn't say anything about how things panned out, I don't know what else will. But in the end, Bert got his twins, and both would blossom into franchise greats for Vancouver. Daniel and Henrik both played in over 1,000 games, both producing over 1,000 points. Daniel became the goal scorer, and Henrik the playmaker, and both read off one another to perfection, making Vancouver constant threats for the next decade. Fast forward to 2002, where the Florida Panthers would take home the #1 pick, and they had their eyes set on defenseman Jay Bouwmeester, but thinking they can get him a bit lower in the draft, they would make a trade with the Columbus Blue Jackets on draft night, trading away the #1 pick in exchange for the #3 pick and the right to swap picks in 2003. This trade benefited both sides, as the Blue Jackets, in desperate need of a face of the franchise, found their guy in Rick Nash, who would dominate the 2000s, scoring one of the greatest goals of the decade against the Phoenix Coyotes. And as for the Panthers, they got their wish, selecting Jay Bouwmeester, who would be a solid defensive presence for both the Panthers and then the Flames later down the line. The last time the first overall pick was traded was back in 2003, which once again will involve the Florida Panthers, as this would be the second year in a row where they would hold the #1 spot only to trade it away. This time, they had their eyes set on selecting Nathan Horton, but knowing they could probably select him later in the draft, they decided to yet again move down. This time, swapping picks with the Pittsburgh Penguins, who at the time were actually in desperate need of talent. The team was described by some as having, quote, AHL level talent, and were also rumored to potentially relocate to Kansas City. So by securing the first overall pick, it now gave the struggling franchise a bit more security. They would use that pick to select Marc-Andre Fleury, making him the first goaltender to be selected first overall since Rick DiPietro in 2001. And unlike DiPietro, Fleury would have a remarkable career in Pittsburgh, breaking numerous franchise records and guiding the team to 3 Stanley Cups. The Flower would become the backbone of the franchise for the next decade. Florida would actually be able to take Nathan Horton, who had a pretty solid career. In a previous video discussing the 03 draft, I sorta just wrote Horton off, in a way discrediting him, as eventually he would drastically fall off, but that was due to a gruesome injury which I failed to mention, as beforehand, Horton was actually a very consistent player. The trade also featured the Panthers getting a 2nd round pick, which didn't turn into much, but the 3rd round pick the Penguins got turned into Daniel Carcillo. Trading any draft pick is a complete risk, but trading away the first overall pick is a complete gamble, as you never know whether the person selected will be a household name or the NHL's next big bust. And as shown in today's video, you never know what's going to happen, but in the end, it leaves for some entertaining results. Moral of the story, never swap your draft picks, as they can screw you over in more ways than one.